You know that idea that one powerful leader, a real political savior, could just sweep in and fix everything? Well, today we're going to dig into a pretty critical take on that, exploring one author's argument that this fantasy of a single person conquering the system is just that, a fantasy. So let's just get right to it. Here's the core question we're tackling. Is the whole idea of a political savior just an illusion? And look, this is a tough question because it hits at a hope a lot of us have, no matter where we are on the political map. Okay, so full disclosure here, we're unpacking a specific and, a pretty cynical viewpoint. The basic idea is this. No matter how powerful a leader might look, they are going up against a deeply entrenched system that just does not want to change. All right, so let's kick things off with the first part of this argument, this whole myth of the conquering king. So the author's throwing a major historical reference at us here with Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. That was the ultimate point of no return, the move that kicked off a civil war and basically ended the Roman Republic. The parallel they're drawing is, when a modern leader tries to conquer the system like that, it might just unleash total chaos with some really devastating consequences. And that's really the heart of it, right? The argument is that pinning all our hopes on one person isn't going to solve our big, messy, systemic problems. Instead, it just becomes the spark for a huge power struggle inside the country, instead of a fight against the actual issues. Okay, so if a leader can't just wave a magic wand and make change happen, why not? Well, that leads us right to the next big point. Because as the author claims, the system itself fights back. You know, what's so fascinating here is how this frames the problem. The argument is that making any real radical change isn't just about politics, it's about your wallet. Any attempt to seriously shake things up would directly threaten the financial security of millions of people. And you can bet that creates a whole lot of immediate opposition. And that's the real kicker here. This makes the system so incredibly powerful. It's not some shadowy group in a back room. As the author points out, it's regular people with 401ks. It's corporations, banks, even government employees whose entire lives and futures are tangled up in the way things are right now. That creates this massive resistance to any kind of major change. Okay, let's get concrete. The author uses one really powerful example to show how this works in the real world: immigration and the labor force. So, to really get to the bottom of this, the author wants us to ask a different kind of question. Forget the politics of immigration for a second and look at the economics. What is actually fueling the growth of the American workforce today? And the answer, based on the data the source points to, is a pretty shocking number: 88%. So what does that 88% really mean? Well, for the author, it's everything. It suggests that a massive chunk of recent labor growth is coming from foreign-born workers who are filling these huge gaps left behind as the native workforce gets older. This isn't really a political statement. It's presented as a hard economic reality that the system now depends on. And that brings us right back to the main point. Here's the million-dollar question the author poses. If the whole economy is basically built on this reality, where is the real political will to drastically change it ever going to come from? From this point of view, the system has already adapted and now relies on the very things some politicians promised to shut down. All right, so if the system is this unstoppable machine, then who's in the driver's seat? The author has a pretty provocative answer, and it might not be who you think. Let's talk about who really pulls the strings. So here's the big disconnect, right? On one side, you have the fantasy that a president, a leader, a king holds all the power. But the reality, according to this author, is that the real control is in the hands of a much less visible elite, folks in finance and tech who actually built and now manage the whole system. And there's actually a name for this idea, a pretty striking one: techno feudalism. It's the concept that our modern power structures are starting to look a lot like the old feudal systems. But instead of land, today's lords control us through technology, through our data, and through complex financial tools. So how does this cybernetic system actually work? The author breaks it down into a simple, kind of scary, 3-step process. First, you collect unimaginable amounts of data on everybody. Second, you use that data with algorithms to subtly shape what people think and do. And the endgame? You get a population that's managed, predictable, and ultimately not very politically engaged. Okay, so we've seen the system, we've seen who the author thinks is pulling the strings. So where does that leave our would-be king? What hope does a political savior actually have? Let's see how this all wraps up. And yeah, the conclusion here is pretty grim. The final verdict is that even if a super strong leader did take power, they wouldn't conquer the system. The system would just absorb them. It would get its people into their administration, maybe threaten them financially, or just slowly twist their agenda until they're just another manager of the status quo. Back to square one. But hold on, it's not all doom and gloom. The author doesn't just leave us there. They pivot with this line, basically saying, if we can just let go of this fantasy of a hero riding in to save us, we can actually start talking about things that might work. Things like building stronger local communities, or figuring out how to deal with corporate power directly. And that's where we're left. It's a huge question to chew on. If this author is right, if the idea of a political savior is just a comforting illusion meant to keep us on the sidelines, then what does taking real power back actually look like? What's next?